She thought she had the perfect marriage until the silence became unbearable. While her husband traveled for work, the loneliness crept in, suffocating her. The only warmth she had left came from Duke, their loyal dog. His presence was more than just comfort. It was a connection, a bond she never expected. As the nights stretched on, she found herself questioning everything. Why did Duke's eyes understand her pain more than her husband did? Why did his touch bring the comfort she craved? The moment her husband returned, she felt it. Something had shifted. They were strangers in their own home. A confrontation was inevitable. Could they fix what was broken? Or had she already found the companionship she truly needed in the most unexpected place? Stay with us to find out how this gripping story unfolds, and don't forget to subscribe for more incredible real-life stories. I always found solace in silence. It was my refuge, a place where I could escape the noise of the world and immerse myself in my thoughts. But with every one of Mark's trips, the silence grew louder, heavier. His business trips, which once seemed like temporary inconveniences, had turned into long stretches of loneliness that I could barely endure. Our home, once filled with laughter and life, now felt empty, as if its walls absorbed all the warmth and light. Mark was a man of ambition. His job required constant travel, and he always left with the confidence that I could manage on my own.
And I did.
In the first days after his departure, I filled my time with chores, cleaning, cooking, reading. But gradually, these activities lost their meaning, and I was left alone with the silence that became more and more oppressive. The only one who brightened my loneliness was Duke, our dog. He had come into our lives years ago as a tiny puppy with oversized paws and curious eyes. Now, he had grown into a strong, confident companion who was always there when I needed him. His presence became my anchor, especially in those moments when I felt like I was drowning in solitude. On evenings when Mark was away, I often sat on the couch, holding Duke close, watching the darkening sky through the window. His warmth, his steady breathing, it all reminded me that I wasn't completely alone. But sometimes, in the quietest moments, I caught myself thinking that his presence had become something more than just comfort. It was a strange, almost inexplicable feeling, one that I tried to ignore. One evening, as I sat on the couch, Duke rested his head on my lap. His eyes looked up at me with such loyalty that it took my breath away. I ran my fingers through his fur, feeling the warmth of his body seep into my skin. At that moment, I realized that his presence wasn't just a source of comfort, it was something much deeper. A feeling I couldn't explain, but one that grew stronger with each passing day. Mark returned a week later. His homecomings had always been moments of joy, but this time, I felt a strange tension in the air. He walked through the door, dropped his bag, and greeted me briefly. I responded, but there was no real excitement in my voice. We stood facing each other, like strangers, and I realized that something had shifted between us. Duke stood nearby, his eyes moving from me to Mark and back again. He sensed the tension, and his presence reminded me that there was someone in this house who truly understood me. I looked at Mark and knew we needed to talk. But the words stuck in my throat, and I remained silent, feeling the weight of the silence wrap around me like a heavy blanket. That night, I lay in bed, listening to the quiet. Mark slept beside me, his breathing even and calm, but I couldn't sleep. Thoughts swirled in my mind like a storm, refusing to settle. The conversation that needed to happen had never begun. Instead, we exchanged a few formal words before he went to bed, leaving me alone with Duke. I got up, careful not to wake Mark, and walked to the living room. Duke lifted his head as I approached, then quietly got up and nudged my hand with his nose. His touch was comforting as always. I sat on the couch, and he curled up beside me, resting his head on my lap. His eyes held such understanding that I felt tears sting my eyes. "What's happening to me, Duke?" I whispered, stroking his head. Of course, he didn't answer, but his presence was enough. I felt his warmth seep into me, filling the emptiness that had grown inside. But along with that warmth came the realization that I was crossing an invisible boundary. This wasn't right, Yet I couldn't stop. Morning came too soon. Mark left for work, saying little. I stayed behind, trying to find the strength to change something. Duke followed me around the house, his presence both a comfort and a reminder that I couldn't keep ignoring my emotions. I decided to take a walk. Fresh air would help me clear my mind. Duke wagged his tail excitedly at the sight of the leash. As we stepped outside, I realized how much I had missed these walks. Mark and I used to walk together, but now it was just me and Duke. He walked beside me, his powerful presence reassuring, making me feel safe. We reached the park, and I sat on a bench, watching Duke explore. His movements were graceful, confident. I looked at him and knew he had become more than just a pet. It was a strange, almost inexplicable feeling, but it was real. When we returned home, I felt a little better. But that feeling faded as soon as I stepped inside. The silence wrapped around me again, and I knew I couldn't continue living like this. Something had to change. That evening, Mark came home looking exhausted. I didn't want to delay the conversation any longer. "Mark, we need to talk," I said, my voice firm. He nodded, understanding that we couldn't keep avoiding this. We sat in the living room, and I finally let out everything I had been holding inside. I told him how lonely I felt, how his constant absences had made me feel abandoned. He listened, his face unreadable. When I finished, he sighed and said, "I know it's been hard for you, but my job. I can't just walk away from it." "I understand," I said, "but I can't live like this anymore. We need to find a way to fix this." He looked at me, a mixture of regret and understanding in his eyes. "What do you suggest?" I didn't have an answer. At that moment, Duke nudged my hand again, grounding me. I stroked his head, feeling his warmth steady me. Mark finally spoke. "I'll try to make more time for us. Just give me some time." I nodded, knowing it was all he could promise for now. Weeks passed. Mark made an effort. He was home more often, we talked more, tried to rebuild what had been lost. But something inside me had already changed. Duke was still there, always beside me. His presence had become more than just comfort. It was something deeper, something I couldn't ignore. One evening, as we walked in the park, I finally admitted it to myself. "You're more than just a dog, Duke. You're my friend, my anchor. And I'm grateful for you." He looked up at me, his eyes filled with unwavering loyalty, and I felt a sense of peace wash over me. I couldn't change the past, but I could shape my future. And I decided I would live it on my own terms, without fear of my emotions. When we returned home, Mark was waiting at the door. He looked at me, searching my face. "Are you happy?" he asked. I smiled softly.
Yes.
"I am." And in that moment, I knew we had both found our way. A way that wasn't perfect but was ours. And that was enough.